The altimeter unwound like a broken clock as Captain Robert Johnson shoved the control column forward, pushing his P-47 Thunderbolt past every speed the manual said was safe. 420 miles per hour. 430. The airframe screamed protest through the metal frame into his hands, a high-pitched keen that every pilot knew meant you were asking the airplane to do something it wasn't designed to survive. 445. Through the windscreen, the formation of Focke-Wulf 190s grew from distant specks to distinct aircraft with terrifying speed. They flew in their precise German spacing, totally unaware that 7 tons of American fighter was falling on them like a meteorite, 450 miles per hour. The wings flexed visibly now. Any faster, and the dive might transition from controlled flight into something else entirely, something that ended with wreckage scattered across French farmland. But Johnson had done the math in his head dozens of times during sleepless nights at Halesworth. At this speed, in this configuration, with this much altitude advantage, he would have exactly 90 seconds from the moment he opened fire until the WWIIs could react, regroup, and turn their superior low-speed maneuverability against him. 90 seconds to do the impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Robert Johnson grew up in Lawton, Oklahoma, where the fastest thing he'd ever seen was a crop duster pulling out of a spray run. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, with romantic notions about dogfighting, the kind of visions that came from newsreels and pulp magazines, where fighters circled each other like medieval knights, trading bursts of gunfire in graceful aerial ballets. The reality of flight training at Randolph Field stripped away most of that romanticism. He learned fly by numbers, by procedures, by the endless repetition of basic aeronautical engineering principles. But one principle stuck with him more than any other, repeated by every instructor who'd survived combat in the previous war. In a dogfight, speed is life. Lose your airspeed and you lose maneuverability. Lose maneuverability and you become a target. The corollary to this principle, accepted as gospel by 1942, was equally simple: never trade altitude for speed recklessly, because you can't get altitude back quickly, but you can always slow down. When Johnson arrived in England in late 1942 and joined the 56th Fighter Group, he found that every tactical doctrine taught to American pilots reinforced this conservative approach to energy management. The Thunderbolt, he learned, was designed as a high-altitude interceptor. At 30,000 feet, it was magnificent, fast, powerful, with 850 caliber machine guns that could see a bomber in half. But down low, in the turning fight, it became a different aircraft entirely. The P-47C model he first flew weighed over 13,000 pounds fully loaded. The Focke-Wulf 190, the Luftwaffe's premier fighter, weighed under 9,000 pounds. In a slow-speed turning engagement, the 4190 could out-turn, out-roll, and out-climb the Thunderbolt with almost insulting ease. German pilots knew this. American pilots knew this. And so the official tactical doctrine, written by men who'd studied every combat report from every theatre, was clear. Use the Thunderbolt's advantages. Stay high. Stay fast. Make diving attacks and zoom back up. Never, under any circumstances, get drawn into a low-altitude turning fight with 400-190s. Johnson's first combat missions in the spring of 1943 followed this doctrine precisely. The 56th Fighter Group would climb to altitude, cruise over France at 25 or 30,000 feet, and wait for the Luftwaffe to intercept the bomber streams. When German fighters appeared, the Thunderbolt pilots would position themselves above and behind, then make careful diving attacks, pick up speed, make one pass, zoom back to altitude. It was methodical, it was safe, and it was profoundly frustrating. The full of 190 pilots had figured out the American tactics within weeks. As soon as a P-47 committed to a diving attack, the German formation would break some climbing, some diving, all turning. By the time the American pilot made his pass and climbed back to safety, the German formation had reformed. The actual kill-to-sortie ratio for those early missions was abysmal. Johnson flew 16 missions in his first 3 months without scoring a single confirmed kill. Neither did most of his squadron mates. They were following doctrine perfectly and achieving almost nothing. The frustration went beyond personal scorecards. Every mission, Johnson and his fellow pilots watched as Luftwaffe fighters worked over bomber formations with systematic efficiency. The B-17 crews were dying while P-47 pilots made their careful, by-the-book diving passes that rarely resulted in kills. The bomber crews called them bolts from the blue, attacks that looked impressive but didn't seem to protect anyone. By June of 1943, Johnson had started spending his off-duty time studying every combat report he could access, looking for any American pilot who'd actually achieved consistent success against 4-190s. The reports showed occasional victories, but mostly they documented the same pattern: diving attack, German formation breaks, climb back to altitude, repeat. The few pilots with multiple kills had gotten lucky with isolated German aircraft or had caught formations of less experienced pilots. But there was another set of numbers in those reports that Johnson couldn't stop thinking about. The Thunderbolt's maximum dive speed was listed as approximately 460 miles per hour before reaching compressibility effects that made the aircraft difficult or impossible to control. Most diving attacks were initiated from 25 to 30,000 feet and executed at speeds between 350 and 400 miles per hour, fast enough to overtake most German fighters, slow enough to maintain control. But the combat reports included several incidents where pilots had inadvertently exceeded 420 miles per hour in emergency situations, usually when damaged and trying to dive away from pursuers. In every case, the Thunderbolt had proven remarkably stable at these extreme speeds. Unlike earlier American fighters, which became uncontrollable in high-speed dives, the P-47's thick wing and massive weight seemed to stabilize it. Pilots reported that above 420 miles per hour, the aircraft became difficult to maneuver. The controls stiffened, the turning radius increased, but it remained controllable. It didn't tumble. It didn't shed parts. It just went very, very fast in whatever direction it was pointed. Johnson began running calculations. If a Thunderbolt initiated a dive from 35,000 feet higher than standard patrol altitude and maintained a steeper dive angle than doctrine recommended, it could potentially reach speeds approaching 450 miles per hour while still maintaining enough altitude to pull out safely. At that speed, the closure rate on a formation of WWIIs would be over 200 miles per hour faster than their maximum level flight speed. They wouldn't have time to break formation. They wouldn't have time to react. The attacking pilot would have one pass and only one pass, because pulling out of that dive and climbing back to safety would take every bit of the Thunderbolt's energy. There would be no second chance. Miss on the first pass, and you'd be a sitting duck, wallowing at low altitude while faster turning FW-190s swarmed you. The tactical math was brutal but elegant. At 450 miles per hour, Johnson calculated he'd be covering 660 feet per second. The effective range of his 50 caliber guns was roughly 1,000 feet. From the moment he entered effective range until he had to break off to avoid collision, he'd have approximately 90 seconds. In that window, he'd pass through an entire German formation if he timed it correctly, if he aimed correctly, if the guns didn't jam, if the wings didn't fold, if he didn't black out from the pull-out G-forces. 90 seconds. It was insane. It violated every principle of energy management he'd been taught. It turned the Thunderbolt's primary weakness, its terrible low-speed performance, into a tactical trap, because after the dive he'd be vulnerable. Every instructor he'd trained under would call it reckless. Every tactical manual said it was wrong. But the alternative was watching more B-17 seconds go down while P-47 pilots made safe, ineffective diving passes. Johnson spent weeks studying the mechanical limits of the Thunderbolt. The airframe was built by Republic Aviation to be nearly indestructible, massively over-engineered compared to the sleek, lightweight fighters other countries produced. The wings were thick enough that pilots joked you could walk through them. The engine was the massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, producing over 2,000 horsepower, a power plant originally designed for bombers. The entire aircraft was built around the principle that American fighters should be able to absorb battle damage and keep flying. But could it handle being deliberately pushed past its design limits? Could it survive sustained flight at speeds the manual listed as dangerous? There was only one way to find out. On a training flight in late June of 1943, when the formation was well away from any other aircraft, Johnson nosed his Thunderbolt over into a steep dive. He let the airspeed build past 400, past 420, watching the wings for any sign of flutter or structural failure. At 435 miles per hour, the controls became stiff, not unresponsive, but heavy, requiring deliberate force to move. At 440, the world outside compressed into a rushing tunnel of speed. At 445, he initiated the pullout, feeling the G-forces multiply against his body. The horizon came up slowly, too slowly, and for a terrifying moment he thought he'd miscalculated, that he'd pushed too far. Then the nose came level, and he was climbing, alive, the Thunderbolt intact. He did it again the next training flight, and the next. Each time, he refined his technique, the exact dive angle needed, the altitude buffer required for pullout, the way the guns would need to be aimed to compensate for the extreme closure rate. He calculated that at 450 miles per hour, he'd need to open fire earlier. An instinct suggested the targets would grow in his gun sights so fast that by the time his brain registered them as close enough, it would be too late. He'd have to start shooting when they still looked small, trusting mathematics over instinct. His squadron mates thought he'd lost his mind. His commander warned him that if he got himself killed testing crazy theories, there'd be no distinguished flying cross, just a letter home explaining that he'd flown into the ground. The conservative doctrine that governed American fighter tactics in 1943 wasn't arbitrary. It was built on hard lessons learned in blood over the previous year of combat. When the 8th Air Force began operations from England in August of 1942, American pilots had been flying aircraft that were already obsolete. The P-40 Warhawk and P-39 Airacobra, while adequate in certain theatres, were outmatched by German fighters over Europe. Early encounters with Bf-109s and Fu-190s had been disasters. American pilots, trained in peacetime tactics that emphasized individual skill and dogfighting prowess, found themselves systematically outperformed by Luftwaffe veterans who fought in coordinated pairs and fours, who understood energy management instinctively, who exploited every weakness in American doctrine and equipment. The arrival of the P-47 Thunderbolt in late 1942 was supposed to change that calculus. The Thunderbolt was unlike any fighter the Army Air Corps had fielded before. It was massive, 14 feet from the ground to the top of the canopy, nearly 41 feet from wingtip to wingtip. Empty, it weighed 10,000 pounds. Fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, and pilot, it approached 14,000 pounds. For comparison, the Supermarine Spitfire, Britain's most famous fighter, weighed just over 6,000 pounds fully loaded. The WWII weighed approximately 9,000 pounds. The Thunderbolt wasn't just heavier than other fighters, it was in a completely different category, closer in weight to some twin-engine aircraft than to its single-engine contemporaries. That massive weight came from a design philosophy fundamentally different from European fighters. Alexander Kartveli, the chief designer at Republic Aviation, had built the P-47 around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that produced 2,000 horsepower. To handle that power, the aircraft needed a massive four-bladed propeller over 13 feet in diameter. To protect that propeller during takeoff and landing, The aircraft needed long landing gear. To house the retracted landing gear, the wings needed to be thick. To supply the engine with air at high altitude, the aircraft needed a turbo supercharger and extensive ducting. To protect the pilot and critical systems, the aircraft incorporated armor plating that added hundreds of pounds. The result was an aircraft that some pilots initially called a flying milk bottle, ungainly on the ground, seemingly too heavy to be an effective fighter. But in the air, at altitude, the Thunderbolt revealed its strengths. At 25,000 feet, where the turbo supercharger could maintain full engine power, the P-47 was fast over 400 miles per hour in level flight. It could outdive anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. The 850 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, carried over 3,000 rounds of ammunition total and could maintain fire for approximately 20 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat, where most engagements were decided in bursts of 2 or 3 seconds. The aircraft could absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter fighters and still return to base. Multiple pilots told stories of returning with cylinders shot out of the engine, control surfaces shredded, and holes large enough to put a fist through, and the Thunderbolt kept flying. But all those advantages came with a cost. The P-47's massive weight and high wing loading, the ratio of weight to wing area, meant it had a large turning radius at any given speed. In a slow-speed turning fight, the kind of engagement that dominated air combat in the First World War and still appeared in training manuals, the Thunderbolt was at a severe disadvantage. A Focke-Wulf 190 or a Messerschmitt 109 could turn inside the P-47's radius with room to spare, getting into firing position while the American pilot struggled to bring his guns to bear. At low altitude, where there was no room to dive away and the Thunderbolt's speed advantage diminished, encounters with experienced German pilots could be fatal. The tactical solution, developed through the winter of 1942 and spring of 1943, was to avoid those situations entirely. American pilots were instructed to maintain altitude advantage, to use the Thunderbolt's superior speed and diving performance to make fast attack passes, and to climb away immediately after each pass. Never slow down, never get into a turning fight. Use the aircraft's strengths and avoid situations where its weaknesses mattered. It was sound doctrine based on realistic assessment of the aircraft's capabilities. The problem was that sound doctrine wasn't producing results. German pilots had adapted to American tactics faster than American pilots could refine them. Luftwaffe training emphasized situational awareness, constantly scanning the sky, checking 6 o'clock, watching for threats from above. When a P-47 began a diving attack, German pilots often had 3 or 4 seconds of warning, enough time to break formation, change altitude, force the American into a choice between breaking off the attack or following into a low-speed engagement where the advantage shifted to the German. The result was that most American diving attacks resulted in no kills, just burned fuel and wasted ammunition. The bomber crews, who were supposed to be protected by fighter escort, continued to suffer catastrophic losses. In the first 6 months of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost over 100 bombers to Luftwaffe fighters. Each bomber carried a crew of 10. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and unsustainable. Johnson wasn't alone in his frustration with conventional tactics. Across the 56th Fighter Group, pilots were having similar conversations in ready rooms and mess halls. The Thunderbolt was supposed to be the answer to the Luftwaffe's fighter superiority, but in practice, it felt like they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. The aircraft had capabilities that doctrine didn't fully exploit. The question was whether those capabilities could be used without getting killed in the process. The mathematics of high-speed diving attacks occupied Johnson's thinking during every mission. He started climbing higher than the rest of his flight, whenever fuel allowed, burning extra gasoline to gain an additional 3,000 or 4,000 feet of altitude. His flight leader noticed and asked what he was doing. Johnson's answer was direct. He was buying options. At 35,000 feet instead of 30,000, he had more potential energy that could be converted into speed if the situation demanded it. The flight leader didn't forbid it, but he didn't endorse it either. If Johnson wanted to experiment on his own fuel supply, that was his choice. The experimental dives continued through July of 1943. Johnson would wait until the flight was returning from escort duty, when they were clear of enemy airspace, and had enough fuel to make it home even after high-speed maneuvering. Then he'd peel off, nose over, and push the Thunderbolt through progressively steeper dives. 430 miles per hour, 435, 440. Each time, he'd note how the controls felt, how much force was required to move the stick, how much altitude he needed to pull out without blacking out or exceeding safe G-loads. He was building an intuitive understanding of the aircraft at speeds most pilots never intentionally reached. The airframe's behavior at extreme speeds fascinated him. Below 400 miles per hour, the Thunderbolt handled like most heavy fighters, solid, stable, requiring firm inputs but responding predictably. Between 400 and 420, the controls began to stiffen noticeably. The stick required more force to move, and the aircraft's response became slightly sluggish. But it was still manageable, still predictable. Above 420, something changed. The control stiffness increased dramatically. Moving the stick felt like pushing against a heavy spring. But the aircraft remained stable. It didn't develop the uncontrollable oscillations or control reversal that plagued other fighters at high speed. The massive weight that made the Thunderbolt such a poor turner at low speeds became an asset in the dive, providing stability and resistance to turbulence. Johnson calculated that at 450 miles per hour, his closure rate on a formation of 4 W190s flying at their maximum speed of approximately 400 miles per hour would be 50 miles per hour, roughly 73 feet per second. But if the German fighters were in a climbing attitude, as they often were when setting up attacks on bomber formations, their airspeed would be lower, perhaps 350 or 360 miles per hour. The closure rate would then be 90 to 100 miles per hour, 132 to 147 feet per second. At that rate, Johnson would cross through a standard Luftwaffe combat formation, roughly 500 yards from first aircraft to last, in approximately 11 seconds. But accounting for the time needed to acquire targets, aim, fire, and transition between aircraft, the realistic engagement window was closer to 60 to 90 seconds from initial contact to breaking off the attack. The critical question was whether he could hit anything during those seconds. At conventional diving attack speeds 350 to 400 miles per hour, pilots aimed by instinct, using lead computing gun sights or, more commonly, simply pointing the aircraft at where they thought the target would be when the bullets arrived. But at 450 miles per hour, the geometry changed. The targets would appear, grow to full size, and flash past in a fraction of the time pilots were accustomed to. Johnson would need to start firing earlier, hold the trigger longer, and trust that the torrent of bullets from 850 caliber guns would intersect with the target's flight path. He practiced visual acquisition on every mission. When the flight was at altitude, cruising over France, Johnson would pick out individual aircraft in bomber formations or other fighter flights and time, how long it took him to recognize them, acquire them in his gun sight, and track them. Then he'd mentally calculate how that timing would compress if he was approaching at 450 miles per hour instead of 300. The numbers were sobering. At high closure rates, he'd have perhaps 2 seconds from the moment a target became identifiable until it filled his windscreen. 2 seconds to recognize friend from foe, center the target in his gun sight, and press the trigger. 2 seconds repeated 6 times if he was engaging a 6-aircraft formation. The opportunity he'd been preparing for came on August 26, 1943. The mission was a bomber escort to the Luftwaffe airfield at Évreux, southwest of Paris. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, conditions that favored fighter combat. The 56th Fighter Group climbed to altitude with two groups of B-17 seconds, taking position at 30,000 feet, 5,000 feet above the bombers. Johnson, burning extra fuel as had become his habit, climbed to 35,000 feet, far enough above his flight that he appeared as a separate dot in the sky. The Luftwaffe reaction came as the bomber formation approached the target. Ground controllers had vectored fighters to intercept, and at 11 o'clock low, Johnson spotted them a formation of 6 Focke-Wulf 190s in a climbing turn, positioning for a head-on attack against the lead bomber group. They were at approximately 25,000 feet and climbing. The geometry was perfect. Johnson was 10,000 feet above them, slightly ahead of their position. If he pushed over immediately, he could intercept them before they reached the bombers. He called his intended attack over the radio. His flight leader acknowledged but warned him not to get separated. Johnson's response was cut short as he rolled inverted and pulled the stick back, pointing the Thunderbolt's nose toward his empty sky 5,000 feet below where the 12 190s would be in approximately 25 seconds. The airspeed built immediately. The dive angle was steeper than any attack he'd practiced, nearly 60 degrees nose down, 300 miles per hour, 350. The engine roared at full power, the propeller a blur, pulling the aircraft through air that was becoming noticeably thicker as altitude decreased. 400 miles per hour. The full 190 formation had still not seen him. They were focused entirely on the bombers, adjusting their spacing for the coordinated attack they'd practiced dozens of times. Johnson could see their yellow propeller spinners now, the mottled camouflage pattern of their upper surfaces. 420 miles per hour. The controls had stiffened as predicted. Moving the stick required both hands, firm pressure. 435 miles per hour. The wings flexed visibly, bending upward under the aerodynamic loads. The airframe groaned with stress. 445 miles per hour. Johnson's vision began to narrow slightly at the edges, not a full tunnel, but the first warning signs that blood was pooling away from his brain under the G-forces of the dive. He eased back slightly on the stick, reducing the dive angle just enough to maintain consciousness, 450 miles per hour. The formation of Felf 190s had grown from distant aircraft to machines with visible rivets and panel lines. He could see the lead pilot's head in the cockpit. Still no reaction from the German formation. Still focused on the bombers ahead and above them, Johnson placed his thumb on the firing button. The gun sight reticle centered on empty air ahead of the lead FW-190. Mathematics and instinct fought in his mind. Shoot now, it's too early, shoot now. He squeezed the trigger at 900 feet, earlier than every fiber of his training said was correct. The .850 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously, producing a combined rate of fire exceeding 100 rounds per second. The recoil, normally noticeable but manageable, felt like a jackhammer at this speed, the entire airframe shuddering with each burst. Tracer's every fifth round was a tracer arced forward in a stream of light that appeared to float slowly despite traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The first burst went high and right. Johnson corrected, walking the tracers down and left. The second burst hit. The lead Focke-Wulf came apart. There was no graceful destruction, no cinematic explosion. At the combined closing speed of nearly 550 miles per hour, the difference between hitting and missing was measured in inches, and when the hits came, they came in rapid succession. The FAV 190's left wing separated from the fuselage at the root. The canopy shattered into fragments. The aircraft transformed from a controlled flying machine into tumbling debris in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Johnson's Thunderbolt, traveling over 200 miles per hour faster than the disintegrating German fighter, flashed through the space where it had been. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The second W190 filled Johnson's gun sight before his brain had fully processed the destruction of the first. His thumb was still on the trigger. The guns were still firing. The tracers walked across the second aircraft's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The WWII's engine cowling erupted in flame, a brief orange blossom that was immediately swept away in the slipstream. The aircraft nosed over into a dive, trailing black smoke. Johnson had no time to confirm the kill. His closure rate was too high, his momentum too great. The remaining 190s had finally reacted. The formation broke, each pilot choosing a different direction of escape. 2 broke left, 1 broke right, 1 dove. But their reaction came too late. Johnson's speed carried him through the space where their formation had been. The third, Focke-Wulf, breaking left, turned directly across Johnson's line of flight. Johnson didn't aim so much as adjust a small correction to the right, holding the trigger down. The burst lasted perhaps 1 second. 50 rounds from 8 guns. 400 bullets in the W190 were flying through. The German fighter's wing folded upward under the impact, and the aircraft spun away. 60 seconds had elapsed since Johnson opened fire. 3 confirmed kills. His airspeed was still above 400 miles per hour. The fourth FW190 appeared in his windscreen. Almost by accident, the pilot had broken left when everyone else broke right, and the maneuver put him directly in Johnson's path. Johnson fired reflexively, without conscious thought. The burst hit the cockpit area. The F2WD-190 nosed over into a vertical dive, smoke pouring from the engine. Whether the pilot was dead or incapacitated, Johnson couldn't tell. The aircraft simply pointed straight down and accelerated toward the French countryside below. The fifth fighter was diving away, the pilot executing exactly the correct maneuver, trading altitude for speed, trying to build separation from whatever had destroyed his formation. But the W190's maximum dive speed was approximately 430 miles per hour, and Johnson was still carrying 420. The German pilot's escape was an illusion. Johnson pulled lead, aiming ahead of the diving aircraft, and fired. The tracers converged in front of the 190. The German pilot flew into his own interception. The tail section disintegrated. The aircraft tumbled out of control. 85 seconds. Johnson's airspeed had finally dropped below 400 miles per hour. His altitude was under 15,000 feet. His ammunition counters showed he'd fired nearly 2,000 rounds. 5 FW190s were destroyed or going down. The sixth and final fighter had made the mistake of trying to climb instinct, training, the desperate need to regain altitude advantage. But Johnson still had momentum. The Thunderbolt, despite bleeding speed, was still faster than the climbing FW190. Johnson pulled up into a high-angle climbing shot, difficult at this speed, requiring precise control inputs that fought against stiffened controls. The last burst from his guns caught the 190 as it climbed across his line of fire. The fuel tank ignited. The aircraft became a fireball. 90 seconds from first shot to last. 6 Focke-Wulf 190s destroyed, and Johnson was exactly where every tactical manual said he'd be: slow, low, vulnerable, his airspeed below 300 miles per hour and still decreasing. If there had been more German fighters in the area, if the Luftwaffe had had a second formation nearby, he would have been an easy kill. The Thunderbolt's terrible low-speed performance, the weakness that doctrine said to avoid at all costs, was now his primary problem. But there were no more German fighters. The attack had been so sudden, so violent, so completely unexpected, that the surviving Luftwaffe pilots in the area were scattered, disorganized, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Johnson's wingman, who'd followed at a more conventional speed and hadn't reached the engagement until it was over, called out that he was clear. Johnson advanced the throttle to full power and began the long, fuel-hungry climb back to altitude. His hands shook on the control column. The adrenaline that had carried him through the engagement was draining away, replaced by the cold realization of how close he'd come to the edge of disaster. The flight back to Halesworth was quiet. Johnson's wingman formed up on his wing and stayed there, close enough that Johnson could see his face through the canopy. The expression was something between shock and disbelief. When they landed and shut down their engines, the ground crew immediately noticed something unusual. Johnson's Thunderbolt had fired nearly 2,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Most pilots came back from missions with hundreds of rounds remaining. Johnson had gone through his ammunition in 90 seconds. The intelligence debrief after the mission lasted over 3 hours. The intelligence officers sat in their small room at Halesworth, smoking cigarettes and taking notes while Johnson described the engagement in detail. 6 confirmed kills in 90 seconds, in a single diving attack. It was unprecedented in the 8th Air Force's experience. The previous record for a single engagement by a P-47 pilot had been 3 kills, achieved over the course of a running battle that lasted several minutes. Johnson claimed to have doubled that in less time than it took to make a cup of coffee. The intelligence officers didn't want to believe it. Their skepticism wasn't personal, it was procedural. Combat reports were notoriously unreliable. Pilots in the chaos of battle often saw aircraft smoking or diving and assumed they were destroyed when they were merely damaged. Multiple pilots sometimes shot at the same target, and each claimed the kill. The official policy required corroboration, gun camera footage, witness testimony, wreckage confirmation. Without multiple sources of evidence, claims were often downgraded to probable or damaged rather than destroyed. Johnson's gun camera footage resolved most of the doubt. The 16mm film, taken through a camera mounted in the wing and triggered automatically when the guns fired, showed 4 of the kills in stark, undeniable detail. The lead FW-190 losing its wing, the second aircraft erupts in flames, the third wing folding, the fourth went into its terminal dive. The footage also showed something else: the incredible speed of the engagement. The targets appeared in frame, were hit, and disappeared in seconds. The normal rhythm of gun camera footage, where aircraft remained visible for several seconds while the attacker maneuvered for position, was completely absent. Johnson's attack looked less like aerial combat and more like a high-speed collision where one aircraft happened to be shooting. Johnson's wingman provided corroborating testimony for the 5th and 6th kills, which had occurred outside the gun camera's field of view. He'd been following Johnson's dive at a more conservative speed, around 380 miles per hour, and had watched the final 2 4-190s go down. His testimony was detailed and consistent with Johnson's account. The intelligence officers, faced with film evidence and witness testimony, approved all 6 kills as confirmed. But their approval came with a caveat. Johnson had gotten lucky, they suggested. The conditions had been perfect. The FW-190 pilots had been focused on the bombers and hadn't seen him coming. He had an ideal altitude advantage. The guns hadn't jammed, always a risk with the .50 caliber Brownings when fired at extreme speeds. The wings hadn't folded under the aerodynamic stress. The pullout hadn't caused him to black out. A dozen things could have gone wrong, probably should have gone wrong. The implicit message was clear. This wasn't a tactic. It was a fluke. Don't try to repeat it. Don't teach it to other pilots. Don't build doctrine around something that worked once under perfect conditions. Johnson listened to their concerns, nodded politely, and disagreed completely. What the intelligence officers saw as luck, he saw as proof of concept. The mathematics had worked. The Thunderbolt had handled the extreme speeds without failing. The engagement window had been exactly what he'd calculated. The kills had come because the German formation had no counter to an attack executed at that speed. Yes, the conditions had been favourable, but favourable conditions occurred regularly. The question wasn't whether the tactic could work, he'd just proved it could. The question was whether it could be refined, systematized, taught to other pilots. Over the following weeks, Johnson became an informal instructor in extreme speed diving attacks. He didn't have official authorization. The 8th Air Force hadn't changed its tactical doctrine, but within the 56th Fighter Group, pilots started asking questions. How steep was the dive? How did you control the aircraft at that speed? How did you aim when the targets were growing so fast? Johnson answered with specifics. The dive angle needed to be between 50 and 60 degrees nose down to build sufficient speed while maintaining enough altitude for pullout. At 450 miles per hour, control inputs needed to be smooth and deliberate. No jerking the stick, no sudden corrections. The aircraft would respond, but slowly. Aiming required starting to fire earlier than instinct suggested and tracking the tracers onto the target rather than trying to point the aircraft perfectly before shooting. The key insight Johnson emphasized was the importance of specific conditions. The extreme speed diving attack wasn't appropriate for every situation. It required significant altitude advantage at least 8 to 10,000 feet above the target. It required that the target formation be focused on something else, allowing the attacker to close without being seen. It required enough fuel to make the climbing escape afterward, and critically, it required that the pilot be willing to accept that this was a one-pass attack. There was no second chance. If you missed, if your guns jammed, if you misjudged the pullout, you'd be slow and vulnerable at low altitude with no energy to escape. The tactic worked, but the margin for error was microscopic. By October of 1943, several other pilots in the 56th Fighter Group had executed successful extreme-speed diving attacks. The results were consistent when the conditions were right. When the pilot executed correctly, the tactic was devastating. German formations broke apart under the high-speed assault, and the kill-to-loss ratio for these engagements was exceptional. But the tactic also claimed casualties. 2 pilots misjudged their pullouts and hit the ground. One pushed the dive too steep and experienced a control flutter that caused structural failure. The aircraft broke apart at 465 miles per hour, just beyond the edge of the safe envelope. The wreckage scattered across French farmland was barely recognizable as an aircraft. The Luftwaffe adapted faster than the Americans had expected. By November of 1943, German fighter controllers had started positioning high-altitude observers, usually experienced pilots in high-performance fighters, specifically to watch for diving Thunderbolts. The observers would fly at 35 or 40,000 feet above the normal combat altitude and call warnings when American fighters had sufficient altitude advantage for extreme speed attacks. Luftwaffe formations began executing preemptive breaks when they received these warnings, scattering before the attack could develop. The window of opportunity narrowed. The tactic remained effective, but only against formations that weren't expecting it. German pilots who survived encounters with extreme speed diving attacks reported them with a mixture of shock and professional analysis. Luftwaffe combat reports from late 1943 described being attacked by Thunderbolts, moving at speeds exceeding 550 km per hour, approximately 340 miles per hour. A significant underestimate of Johnson's actual speed, but still fast enough to convey the unprecedented nature of the attack. One report, filed after a mission over France in September of 1943, stated that defending against such attacks was effectively impossible without advance warning and significant altitude advantage. The conclusion was stark. Avoid situations where American fighters had that advantage. The tactical response from the Luftwaffe was systematic. They stopped loitering at predictable altitudes while waiting to intercept bomber formations. They began attacking bombers in climbing turns or head-on passes, anything to deny the P-47 seconds the altitude margin needed for their devastating dives. They positioned fighters at multiple altitudes, creating a layered defense where high-altitude elements could engage diving Thunderbolts before they reached lower formations. The sophistication of Luftwaffe tactics increased in direct response to Johnson's innovation, forcing American pilots to continue adapting. Johnson flew his last combat mission in May of 1944, shortly before the Normandy invasion. By then, he'd accumulated 27 confirmed kills, making him one of the most successful American fighter pilots in the European theater. But the number that mattered more to him was different: the number of bomber crews who'd made it home because Luftwaffe attacks had been disrupted. That number was impossible to calculate precisely, but it was substantial. Every time a German formation broke under a high-speed attack, every time 4 190s scattered instead of pressing their attack on B-17 seconds, crews survived who might otherwise have died. After the war, tactical analysts at the Army Air Force's School of Applied Tactics studied Johnson's technique extensively. They calculated that his diving attack on August 26 had exceeded 450 miles per hour, possibly reaching 455. At that speed, the kinetic energy of the diving Thunderbolt was approximately 46 million foot-pounds, the equivalent of a locomotive traveling at 70 miles per hour, compressed into a 7-ton package. The structural stresses on the airframe during the dive and pullout had been enormous, approaching the design limits of the aircraft. The fact that the Thunderbolt had survived was a testament to Republic Aviation's engineering, but it was also evidence that the engineers had built in safety margins larger than even they had realized. The broader lesson took years to be fully absorbed into American tactical doctrine. Johnson had demonstrated that aircraft performance envelopes were often more conservative than necessary, that the listed limits in flight manuals incorporated safety factors that could be temporarily exceeded by skilled pilots who understood the risks. But he'd also demonstrated the danger of that knowledge. The 2 pilots who'd died attempting similar tactics had exceeded those margins by too much, pushed too far, misunderstood where the actual edge of the envelope was. The line between innovative tactics and fatal error was measured in miles per hour and degrees of dive angle, and finding that line required experience, calculation, and a willingness to test theories that could kill you if they were wrong. The P-47 Thunderbolt was uniquely suited to extreme speed diving attacks because of its specific combination of characteristics: massive weight for stability, thick wings for structural strength, a powerful engine for the climb back to altitude. Other American fighters couldn't safely execute the same tactic. The P-51 Mustang, lighter and more agile, couldn't dive past 430 miles per hour without risking structural failure. The P-38 Lightning had compressibility problems in high-speed dives that made it nearly uncontrollable above 420 miles per hour. Johnson's tactic was specifically a Thunderbolt tactic, enabled by the aircraft's unique design philosophy. Attempts to apply it to other aircraft types resulted in several fatal accidents before commanders prohibited the practice in lighter fighters. Robert Johnson survived the war and returned to Oklahoma, where he lived quietly until his death in 1998, at the age of 78. He gave occasional interviews about his combat experience, usually when aviation historians sought him out for oral history projects. He remained uncomfortable with the attention that came with being a high-scoring ace. He'd done his job, he said. He'd figured out how to make an airplane work better. The 6 kills in 90 seconds became a story that was told and retold in fighter pilot communities, sometimes with embellishments that made Johnson wince. The dive became steeper in the retelling, the speed faster, the number of Germans larger. The truth needed no embellishment. On August 26, 1943, over France, Johnson had executed a tactic that violated every principle of conventional fighter doctrine and proved that sometimes the textbooks were wrong. The dive at 450 miles per hour, dismissed as insane by every tactical manual, had been exactly fast enough to deny the full of 190s the time they needed to react. The vulnerability afterward, the terrible position of being slow and low that doctrine said to avoid, had been acceptable because there were no German fighters left to exploit it. Johnson had taken the Thunderbolt's greatest weakness, its poor, low-speed handling, and made it irrelevant by ensuring the fight never reached low speeds long enough to matter. The 6 German pilots who died that day had been flying aircraft that were superior to the Thunderbolt in conventional combat. The WWII could turn tighter, roll faster, climb better at medium altitudes. In the kind of dogfight that resembled medieval jousting matches, where aircraft circled and maneuvered for advantage, they should have dominated. They'd trained for that kind of combat. They'd mastered the tactics that worked in those conditions. They had never imagined an opponent who would dive at speeds that seemed suicidal just to avoid fighting on terms where they had advantages. That was the real lesson of Johnson's 90 seconds, not courage, though that was required, and not skill, though that was essential. The lesson was that you could change the nature of combat itself. You could take a disadvantageous situation and transform it into something your opponent had never trained for, never imagined, never developed doctrine to counter. You could make 90 seconds of calculated risk more effective than hours of textbook perfect conventional tactics. The cost of that transformation was accepting risk that most pilots, most commanders, and most tacticians would consider unacceptable. But the alternative was following doctrine that wasn't working, watching bombers die while you made safe, ineffective attacks. Johnson made the calculation. The mathematics worked. The Thunderbolt's wings held, 6 Focke-Wulf 190s didn't, and for 90 seconds over, France, the nature of aerial combat changed because one pilot decided that 450 miles per hour, while insane by every conventional measure, was exactly the speed at which doctrine stopped mattering and physics took over. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.